Good afternoon, and welcome to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. I'm Sushma Raman, the Executive Director. It's my privilege to welcome you today on behalf of the Center and Mathias Risse, who will join us for the Q&A portion of today's event. Joining us for today's webinar as part of the Center's series Towards Life 3.0, Technology and Ethics in the 21st Century is Dr. Aisha Richardson, an award-winning journalism instructor and scholar who studies how marginalized communities use mobile and social media to produce innovative forms of journalism, especially in times of crisis. Dr. Richardson is Assistant Professor of Journalism at USC Annenberg School. She researches how African Americans use mobile and social media to produce innovative journalism. She's the author of Bearing Witness While Black, African Americans, Smartphones, and the New Protest Journalism, published in 2020 by OUP. The book explores the lives of mobile journalist activists who have documented the Black Lives Matter movement using their smartphones and Twitter. Dr. Richardson will address some of the following types of questions. What is the human toll of bearing witness? How do we choose which stories to tell publicly, and who controls these narratives? Do visual narratives and counter-narratives of the violence inflicted upon African Americans result in greater accountability or in reinforcing social hierarchies and white supremacy? Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Richardson. I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation, after which we welcome questions from our audience.
Thank you, Dr. Raman, and thank you for having me today. I really admire a lot of the work that comes out of the Carr Center, and I've followed you and your team for many, many years. And so it's really a treat to visit Cambridge virtually as a speaker today and talk about many of these issues that arise when we are really studying what people are doing with their cell phones, especially at some of the most difficult times of their life. And so today I really want to talk about some of the theory of Black witnessing and discuss how I came or arrived at some of the conclusions that I've been discussing for the last 10 years or so. I also want to dig into who are some of the leaders of this vanguard, who should we be paying attention to, and how have their meteoric rises from just being on the front lines as citizen journalists to many times being embedded in some of our most respected news organizations, how has that changed journalism? And then in the third part of that, I want to trouble our thinking a bit about mobile journalism to kind of relieve it of this kind of technological determinism and not just say it's just this wonderful new technology that's democratized everything. Because as many of us know, that's not what the 3.0 analysis is. In fact, the 3.0 analysis really digs into what are some of the consequences of this technology that we did not foresee, but that we are definitely dealing with now. So I'm excited to engage in a conversation with you all and answer any questions that you may have after I'm done. So what I'm going to do is share my screen now so that you can see some of these images that have captured and captivated our thinking over this last decade as we've watched the Black Lives Matter movement grow and in the 10 years since Trayvon Martin was killed. And I think about Trayvon a lot, especially since it's been 10 years since his death. And I also think about it as a parallel in terms of how it has galvanized the largest social justice movement of American history. And that is as cited by the New York Times in 2020. And I often think about how that movement was launched by Black youth with cell phones. And I think that fact is lost a lot. And I hope after today's talk, we talk about it a lot more. I want to open us up with one of the quotes I came across in graduate school in 2014 when I was thinking of how can I describe this phenomenon that I'm noticing out in the world, and what kind of language would I need to give it? Because it's more than just looking, it's more than just picking up a cell phone when you feel kind of in the hairs stand up on your neck that something is going wrong. It's intentional and purposeful and has so much weight to it. And in many ways, I was minding my own business and came across this New York Times article because I was doing some research on James Baldwin's activism. And it said, Black people need witnesses in this hostile world. And it gave me such pause to hear James Baldwin say that. I thought, why would he use that word witnesses? It's a loaded word. It has a legal weight to it, as if you're taking the stand. It has a moral or theological weight to it, because many religions around the world think that bearing false witness or lying is one of the biggest sins you can commit. And so when I began to think about witnessing in a journalistic sense, in the way that I'd been studying it as an eyewitness, I began to see that there are several layers of looking that African Americans are engaging in when they use their cell phones. And that's something that I hadn't really seen in the literature before. In fact, I'd seen different theories that describe the farther away you are from a galvanizing incident, the less impact that it has, and it loses its impact over time and deteriorates even further depending on the medium. And so when I began to see that, and I began to think about the witnessing that has risen to the top and remained at the top of global consciousness, I began to look at how Jewish Americans and Jewish citizens across the world, in fact, use their witnessing to make sure that people never forget about the original sin of the Holocaust. And so when I thought about Jewish witnessing and all of the work that it does to tie any modern act of anti-Semitism to the Holocaust, and even further back beyond to persecution of Jewish people, I began to think this is something that African Americans have been doing as well. In fact, you heard quite often when Trayvon Martin was murdered that this is this generation's Emmett Till. And I kept thinking, how can a teenage boy who died in 1955 be tied to today's youth that we're thinking about, but we're not making those same linkages, that this ethnocentric lens, this ethnocentric way of looking at witnessing is how we can best describe what Black people are doing with those smartphones. And so that's what I set out to do, being galvanized by James Baldwin and his notion of what witnessing is and how it's needed in the world really set me on this journey. And I should say that I'd been studying journalism, mobile journalism, for quite some time. Even before the cell phones came out, I worked at Johnson Publishing for one of the oldest Black magazines in the country, Jet Magazine. And when Mr. Johnson was alive, he had the pleasure of really talking about the impact that his magazine made on the world. And in fact, Mamie Till Mobley, Emmett Till's mom, trusted him to publish the pictures of her son in his pages because she knew the power of media and how it humanizes. And when I got to the newsroom and looked around a bit as a youth, 21, 22 years old, and didn't see many people who looked like me, I began to question how I could create this pipeline of a diverse set of journalists, because I kept seeing all these dismal reports about how the internet was going to crush journalism and how diversity hadn't spiked at all. And knowing about policy reports, I can't be at the Carr Center and not mention policy reports, thinking about things like the Kerner Commission report and how it said that Black media was lacking. And that's how that voicelessness gave rise to such an anger. All of those things really created such a passion in me to figure out how can I, in this small space of my home state in Maryland, create something that would lower the barrier of entry for Black students at this HBCU where I was teaching, and also take advantage of new tech. And in 2010, it was the first year that the iPhone came out with this front and rear facing camera on an iPhone. And this is the commercial that my students and I made to explain what in the world we were doing in the Mojo Lab, as we called it.
Mojo is a mobile journalist. It's a student who reports using only mobile devices. The equipment has gotten a lot smaller for reporting. You see how our head is still at the top and sometimes out of the frame? Very nice. You can report from a cell phone these days and then send it right back to the newsroom using a Wi-Fi connection or any local type of internet connection. And that's really what we want to instill in our students, is that when you see news right on the spot, you do have the ability to capture it and send it back someplace and get paid for it. A lot of them are kind of getting out of the mindset of, I have to work for the next big media outlet. And a lot of them are getting more comfortable with the introduction of this Mojo project with working for themselves. Journalism is serious. It's hard. It's not something that you're just going to succeed at very quickly. Good, it was steady. She's right in the middle. The way that you sound has to kind of translate to different places. Let's do that again. Don't try to hide it. That's really what the Mojo project is giving them these new mobile skills and also teaching them how to be entrepreneurial in the process of gathering or reporting news.
So my students became these kind of warriors on this journey with me to kind of evangelize what we thought the cell phone would become and what it would do for news. And I took them everywhere with me. This became a real hobby of ours to figure out which conference is coming to Washington, D.C. or Baltimore this month, and how can we crash it, so to speak. And so we were invited many, many times to come and present what the Mojo Lab was all about. And it was being in the right place at that right time that really helped explode this idea, because my students, by the time they finished my program, were able to go out into the streets when Baltimore erupted in response to Freddie Gray's killing. And my Mojos were right in the front, and they were on the front lines with their phones. I was happy to see many of them had graduated and gone into traditional news, and were still on the front lines with their phones and with other tools that are a little more sophisticated, but still never lost that skill. And I took students with me abroad. Here we are. I was invited to South Africa to work with Global Girl Media to teach young girls in that area how to use cell phones to report news. One of my favorite times there with them is seeing how that barrier of entry, again, to technology can be lowered. And we didn't need fancy satellite trucks to get going. We had cell phones, we had some equipment that was kindly donated from companies that had heard about what we were trying to do, and we began to get all kinds of donations flooded in. And in this particular picture, we're in Nelson Mandela's hometown of Kliptown, and one of my students decided to do a story about what his passing would mean for South Africa, because he was very sick at this time. And we just went on this kind of voyage where we're talking to lots of young people that were coming across, and everybody soon found out what we were doing and wanted to jump in and talk to us. So it was a really fun time getting to see my students who normally probably wouldn't have had access to this kinds of equipment doing journalism. I should also mention that while I was on the continent in 2011 is when the Arab Spring erupted. And during that time, the State Department, who sponsored our trip, was asked to do a peacekeeping mission, if you will, in Morocco, because there had been so much unrest in Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt. Nearby, Morocco said we would definitely like it if we could have some kind of democratizing program here so that people feel like they have a voice. And so here I am talking to a group of trainers to train the trainers on how we can create a Mojo program and replicate our lab's model at their schools. This was an entirely popular project, I should mention. We were trending as girls on the street because in Morocco, we were not really supposed to be out without male accompaniment. And you can't tell by I'm sitting, but I'm only about 5'2". So to see a gaggle of young ladies behind me with these devices really captured everybody's attention. And one day there was a dad who came downstairs who said, "Are you the girls on the street?" And we said, "I guess," we had no idea we were trending. And he brings 6 little girls down and said, "I want them to join you." And his daughters joined us that day. And so here are several other students in Morocco, again, through Global Girl Media, working very hard to make sure that people know what this technology is and what it can do. And we were in an open air market, a souk as they're called there, just doing this journalism and trying to get better at this and trying to make sure our shots were steady and our audio is good. It was a fun time of experimentation and wonder. And that's when I joined you all. I became a fellow at the Nieman Fellowship, the Nieman Center in the Lippman building. And in the Lippman House is really where I had time as a fellow to digest all that I'd seen over those last couple of years. And I really tried to put into motion an academic study of mobile journalism. I didn't want to just be a trainer anymore. I really wanted to talk about the impact this was having at a global scale. And I decided after that year as a Nieman Fellow to go back to school to get my PhD from the University of Maryland. And here are my kids very happy that I can come outside again. And while I'm in school, I am, of course, doing the work of scholarship and reading all of the literature I can possibly get my hands on about mobile journalism. And a lot of the literature at that time covered the Arab Spring and particularly Egypt. And this is footage from the Academy Award-winning film, The Square, which focused on how citizen journalists brought this news to the world's attention. I should also mention that Occupy Wall Street is still going on when I am in Africa proper. And when I got back home, it had started to peter out, but I was endlessly fascinated by people like Tim Pool, featured here, who attached a drone onto his cell phone and got the only aerial footage of Occupy that exists, I think, even still to this day, because news helicopters could not get behind that dense lattice of skyscrapers that you see behind him. But in all my searches and in all my research, I did not find any account of what this particular video meant to the world. And as a young girl who was getting ready to be 9 years old, I remember sitting underneath my dad's arm and kind of looking at this footage and crying. And my dad, being the stoic Caribbean guy he is, refused to cry, but his voice cracked and kind of defied him. And he's like, back home, they don't do this to people. And I said, back home? I live here. I'm American, first generation. What does this mean for us? What does this mean for my brother? What does this mean for me? And, as most African-American parents know, it's then time to have the talk. And we did. We had to talk about how police encounters would be different for us than it might be for our peers who don't look like us. And this video is a watershed moment and shining a light on police brutality. And George Holliday passed away of COVID recently, but I sat on a panel with his daughter, with Laura King, Rodney King's daughter, just 2 weeks ago. And she talked at length about how this video really had an impact, not just on the world, but on her dad. And she said, even though he didn't die that night, a part of him did. And having to see that video over and over and over again, the worst moment of his life play out, and then no justice, was something that her family had to grapple with for a long time. So even before meeting Laura and her family and really kind of getting into the finer inner workings of how this video impacted how we see police brutality, I'm still a student in school. And the very first week of school is when police kill Michael Brown Jr. and Ferguson erupts. And I learn about the, initial thrust of what caused the protests. And it's that his body is lying in the road for more than 4 hours in this August heat. And his mother is not allowed to pass the police tape to cover him. And as the moms are trying to comfort her and calm her down, a crowd grows. And I learned this not from any local or national news network. I learned this from a man called Emmanuel Freeman online. And Emmanuel is endlessly tweeting and posting pictures and is giving a day by day, well, hour by hour, really, breakdown of what's going on. So that by the end of the day, he says, look, I'm done talking about this. And it's kind of like he's giving us his formal sign off as a citizen journalist. And he never does any other traditional interview, but his footage is what most of what we now know Black Twitter tunes into. And we're matching that up alongside what we see on, by then, as nightfall starts to set in, national news. And as we see these kind of tear gas plumes and all these other things, the fire and the brimstone, if you will, I can't help but match that up to the really peaceful beginnings of what I saw. And I began to get upset with my industry, knowing that I'd been a journalist for almost 10 years, being in the newsroom for almost a decade. I'd come to have a certain respect for official news. And I'd even come to be very, very skeptical initially of citizen journalists, because I was thinking, well, they may not have the ethical training or the skill. How do we know we can trust it? But it's in this moment where I'm looking at Emmanuel Freeman's transcripts and matching it up to that of the national news when I realize that there is a new force in town. And it's not just an accidental force in the way that George Holliday's was, that this is intentional. And it's intentionally trying to create a counter narrative that will outlast, hopefully, the lie. And that's when something stirred in me. And I thought, this is the kind of witnessing that we've seen before. We've seen it in terms of the Holocaust. We've seen it in terms of people who would deny that major atrocity being brought low, by things like Anne Frank's diary, by all of the pictures, by the shoes. I remember being a kid in DC of my hometown and the Holocaust Museum opening. And the exhibit that got me most was the shoes, seeing that these were real people and knowing that I couldn't separate this from an abstract history lesson anymore to something that really happened. That's what I really wanted to create in people when they recognized that this movement was burgeoning. And I watched the Black Lives Matter movement grow from something that was at first reviled and distrusted. You saw Blue Lives Matter, all lives matter, all kind of rebuttals that came up first. And that's why I set out to write this book, Bearing Witness While Black, African Americans, Smartphones, and the New Protest Journalism. It started out as a term paper at first, and then grew. I said, no, I want to do my dissertation on this. And then I just kept, unfortunately, finding case after case after case study. It just would not end. And it ended up being a book-length project that I pursued for the next 7 years or so. And this is how I'm defining Black witnessing for us today to engage in a conversation with you. And it has three main characteristics. Black witnessing is a form of surveillance, and that means looking from below. So whereas surveillance happens on high, blue light cameras, helicopter cams, dash cams, CCTV cams, surveillance is something that is done by authorities and people who hold power. But surveillance is that glaring back from below. It's the, I know you're looking at me, but I'm looking back at you too. And also Black witnessing leverages ad hoc news wires to do its work. Whatever technology exists at the time is what will be used to transmit the message. And then the last part is that what makes Black witnessing so unique is that it relies on these interlocking public spheres. And I've read a lot of Catherine Squires and really fell in love with her idea of the public sphere as it pertains to Black people being one that is broad and not reliant upon class. So you're just as likely to hear from a Darnell or Frazier using this technology than you would LeBron James. And that led me to think this is not a new phenomenon. You know, I cannot simply say that cell phones empowered African Americans to do this work, because in fact, African Americans have been trying to bear witness to human rights and justices as long as they've been here, as long as they've been in the United States. And so I began to conceptualize these three overlapping eras of domestic terror against African Americans, beginning with slavery, and then giving way to lynching as slavery is abolished, and then giving way to police brutality as the civil rights movement starts to really pick up and Black people find themselves face to face with canine units and police on horseback trying to stop them from marching to vote. And throughout each of these eras, you find exemplars, you find people who are hacking that technology of that day to tell stories and to do news. And so as a journalism scholar, this became very exciting to me, this thread, this almost unbroken chain of Black people who are using technologies to tell Black stories. And I thought about Frederick Douglass, and I began to read all of his autobiographies. He wrote 3 of them for us to know about the horrors of slavery. And he escaped slavery at the age of 20 and begins doing this work. And as newspapers start to pick up and that technology takes off, he becomes a newspaper man. And he also becomes a mentor to Ida B. Wells. And Ida B. Wells, even as a young person, 20 years old, starts writing and starts picking up this pen so that people will know what is going on in the South. And she creates a red record, an official record of all the African Americans who are being lynched in her region, and is sneaking down in many cases from safe spaces up north back down into the belly of this beast, almost in the same way that Harriet Tubman would have gone back into the South to get more and more slaves free. And I thought, as the technology evolved yet again, and you see a visual turn from newspapers to TV, we know that CNN didn't exist in the 60s. We didn't have 24-hour news networks. We had 15 minutes of fame, so to speak. And that's what John Lewis and his team knew. People who were affiliated with SNCC and SCLC and NAACP, they all knew we have to stage our sit-ins and our marches around the time of this nightly news broadcast so people can see what we're talking about. And that brings us to today. Now that we are in the age, fully situated in this visual age, and everybody has a tool in their pocket to tell stories. That's when you see these Black witnesses emerge. Black people who are realizing that the only thing standing between you and death sometimes is a cell phone to keep you alive. And I often think about what people like Diamond Reynolds would have done if she did not have a cell phone to record Philando Castile's last moments. Would she still be alive to tell her story? And that question would not leave me alone as a grad student. And so I began to try to gather as many voices as I could, some famous people that you know, like Alicia Garza, one of the foundresses of the Black Lives Matter movement. Some people you may not know, some people who were students at the time like me who have since risen to the top ranks of not only academia, but our public consciousness. People like Clint Smith, your very own Harvard University graduate, who started out tweeting about the Black Lives Matter movement and drawing historical parallels to the civil rights movement and before, and now is a best-selling author and a journalist for The Atlantic. People like your very own Eve Ewing, who went to Harvard as well, who began her own publications to report on the Black Lives Matter movement, creating magazines on Medium so that people would get the truth and not what was misunderstood by the mainstream. There were artists here, all kinds of folks. I want you to hear from a few of them before we go into our question and answer. And this is Brittany Packnett, who you may remember. She's one who I spoke to in the very beginning of this journey. And she was just finishing up school and just landed a job at Teach for America when she felt compelled to go back home to Ferguson and be on the front lines. She too saw Emanuel Freeman's first posts and was upset by how her hometown was being portrayed in the mainstream. She eventually was asked by President Obama to join his 21st Century Commission for Policing. But here's what she had to say about her early engagement as a citizen journalist.
On the ground, people would go up to cameras and say, until people are tweeting me right now, calling me right now, saying that you are reporting this incorrectly, so we're going to stand here in front of your camera until you decide to tell the truth. So there was not only a decision to give the truth ourselves, there was also a clear decision to challenge mainstream media and hold them accountable to speaking the truth as well. And social media gave us the access to do that.
So as you hear Brittany saying to my class, you can hear my students in the background like, oh my goodness, because almost all of these folks lent their time to talk to my classes as well. She felt a real need to revise the narrative. And in many cases is still doing that. Right now, you may recognize that she's a correspondent on MSNBC and has risen from being someone on the front lines with a cell phone to now being fully embedded in a space that she once felt needed lots of improvement. You may know Clint Smith from his famous TED Talk, How to Raise a Black Boy in America. And he's one I reached out to not only after I saw his TED Talk, but realized he was a student just like me, grappling with how do we work and teach in this space when we feel such a connection to the people we're seeing being murdered on screen who look like relatives of ours. And one of the things he told me was that he doesn't try to separate that anymore.
I started graduate school the same week Mike Brown was killed, and so it was impossible for me to disentangle what I saw happening in the world and what I was reading about in my book. So I started to use Twitter as a way to share sort of snippets of what I was learning.
And his tweets became something that people trusted, and as his following grew and as he became more popular, I think about 900 people attended his defense, his PhD defense a couple years ago at Harvard by Zoom. And he became a #1 New York Times bestselling author for How the Word is Passed. So again, someone who noticed this injustice, hacked the technology, became a journalist who was set on doing a counter narrative practice. That became one of the things he's most famous for right now. I also think you all know Aisha Evans. I was abroad when this picture ran across the cover of magazines everywhere. I'd been in the air in an overnight flight to Italy to lecture about Black Lives Matter when Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were killed back to back. And so when I stepped off the plane, groggy, it's humid, it's hot, and I see this picture as one of the very first things on a newsstand, because one of the things I do as a journalist is always look at the news around me wherever I go. Unfortunately, I thought this looks like home. And what has happened at home? And so I asked the guy who was selling these magazines what occurred. And he said a lady with a cell phone recorded, she used Facebook Live to record a man being killed by police. And I later found out that it was Philando Castile. And Aisha, like me, was so moved by this video because it's the first time that we got to see this in near real time. And Facebook Live was a brand new feature for the platform. And so Aisha was not a part of any organization formally. She just decided to catch a bus down to Baton Rouge from New York, where she's from, and she was promptly arrested. And this is what she had to say about her peaceful stand.
I didn't even know what I was being charged with until my bond was posted, until I had an amount for me to bail out of jail with. Until then, I didn't know what I was being, detained for. In prison, not jail, not no central bookings, like prison. It's real in Louisiana.
You can hear her talking to my students, and many of the young men in the class were brought to tears by the description of how she was treated and zip tied and not knowing really what her formal charge was for quite some time. Again, she had her cell phone with her and was able to ping her relatives and let them know where she was. And that brings us to the events of 2 years ago now. And believe it or not, this book was written as a time capsule to capture what Black activists were doing from 2014 to 2018. And then COVID hits. And Oxford University Press said, our presses have officially stopped. Literally, no one is in here publishing anything. We don't know when your book is going to come out. And I was sad, but I understood, okay, the priority and the headlines are all about COVID. But me, ever being the mobile journalism nerd and scholar, I kept bookmarking things online that said, this looks like Black Lives Matter, the COVID edition. I am seeing a Black doctor in Miami, for example, whose wife feels like she needs to film him being frisked by police for his ID when all he was trying to do was treat homeless individuals in Miami's city center. And when he gets back home, she pulls out her camera and he says, please go get my ID, let them know what I'm doing. And it's that phone again that is establishing his humanity and perhaps saving his life. So I stick up a pin in that. I also stick a pin in some news I'm starting to hear from Georgia about a case about a man named Ahmaud Arbery. And I look at that video and I get chills and I realize this is not Black witnessing, this is something different. Instantly, I realize the gaze is different. It feels almost like a lynching photograph. It feels like a celebratory attaboy. And I can hear in that video almost like the cocking of a gun. I'm like, did I imagine that? Is this person participating in this? What is going on? I stick a pin in that. I start to hear about Breonna Taylor. And at this point, really get upset because I know that women, especially women without video, have a hard time finding justice. And then George Floyd is killed. And all of a sudden, we my book comes out May 15th. He's killed May 25th. And all of a sudden, my publisher says, this is the time. This is the time where we have to discuss these overlapping eras of domestic terror that you've been trying to really drive home in this book. And the New Yorker publishes this magazine cover by the great Kadir Nelson, which does in one photograph, in one painting, what I attempted to do in almost 300 pages of book. And that is visualized for you, these three overlapping eras of domestic terror. At the very bottom, you see the Middle Passage and how Africans would have been lined up in the bowels of many ships for points, set off for points west to be enslaved. We also see the very first photograph, photojournalism, if you will, of a man who came to be known as Whipped Pete, who sat for the Union Army and allowed them to photograph this lattice of scarring on his back. And we also see in the middle, in the very middle, where I started this whole lecture with Rodney King in his video. And just above him, we see Emmett Till. We see Dr. King's last stand before he was assassinated, I am a man. We see Trayvon Martin is here, Breonna Taylor is here. Medgar Evers and Malcolm X are here, Sandra Bland and Michael Brown and Ahmaud Arbery and Trayvon Martin, and on, and so many people who could not even fit despite Mr. Floyd's large frame. And it's in this moment that I realized that we are experiencing a new turn And this is the part where I want to trouble citizen journalism for us. This is where it gets very complicated, because in the very beginning, we were very happy and excited about, finally, people will believe us. You know, we have this footage, we have proof. Look at this and get justice for these people. But again, when I think about the Ahmaud Arbery case, and I thought about what that video was doing, the function it was performing, and I also noticed my own colleagues in the journalism industry playing Mr. Floyd's video over and over and over again, almost with the casual air of a sports highlight, oftentimes not blurring his face. I began to get very upset with this whole movement, with this whole mobile journalism technology, because I said, now we have a conundrum. This is almost, if we're not careful, going to lapse into lynching photography. And as many of you know, lynching photography was a celebratory documentation of a lynching. You would have a sanctioned photographer there who would take pictures and then reproduce them in postcards and then sell them. And in fact, the Comstock Act was passed so that these things could stop, so that you could not send anything lewd in the mail in an open way anymore. And what Ida B. Wells knew at that time is that this circulation wasn't helping, it was re-traumatizing. So what she and W.E.B. Du Bois and many others from the NAACP do is send white allies to points south to purchase up all of these lynching photographs, take them out of circulation, and create a shadow archive. And they publish it one time in The Crisis, their main magazine, and after that, no more. And so that's what I started to call for my colleagues to do. I said, yes, we had this whole movement against lynching. And this is the NAACP's headquarters in New York, where they had this flag, "A man was lynched yesterday." And this was a reimagined flag by one of the subjects in my book, Dred Scott, who put, "A man was lynched by police yesterday." And the flag was just as incendiary as it was in the past. And when I see these things juxtaposed, I begin to think it's time to write again. And so that's what I did in 2020, after finally bringing myself to watch the entire Floyd video. And after seeing how carelessly the video is being used in pop culture and on the news, I said, let's have a more sacred viewing of these videos. If we can, let's really strive to create a shadow archive of these. And I said, we have precedents. African Americans are the only ones who have to watch themselves die over and over again in the mainstream media. Let's create new policies in the newsroom where we stop that. We've done it for, if we think about it, many cases where white people have died violently. And I told my colleagues, let's think about, I'm old enough to remember being in the newsroom during 9/11, and think about all of the white people that we saw falling from those buildings and how we wept together and how we made sure that people did not see that footage. We said, we're not putting this on our news networks. We're not putting this on our websites. No one needs to see this to know that something ghastly happened here. I think about Daniel Pearl and about how, as a young journalist, I wanted to be very much in his role of traveling the world and seeing the world. And when he was killed by terrorists online, it shook the journalism industry. Yet we worked very hard to remove that video from online. And it's very difficult to find. It's in the darkest corners of the web, and I think it should not even be there, but we've done a very good job of making sure that it's erased from the web. And then the last example that I gave many people on this kind of tour I was taking in 2020 was letting people know that during mass shootings, we make sure that any of those mass shootings that affect especially large groups of white people, that those incidents are scrubbed from the web. And I also reminded them that here on the West Coast, we had the Las Vegas Music Festival, and there initially were leaks of so many different videos of people just running and being terrified. And those videos were erased, scrubbed from the web. And so I said, let's do this. As an industry, can we promise that we will give African Americans that same dignity in their last moments? And they said, well, what will we put on TV? And I said, the low-hanging fruit, the lazy thing, is to publish the death. Right? It is to broadcast that final moment, the worst moment of their life. But it's harder to show. Protests are sometimes boring, like this one. People are kind of just milling around, trying to figure out what song to sing next. Sometimes they're dancing, sometimes they're cooking out. And a lot of times there's not the same group of people in the morning and afternoon shift then comes out to agitate in the evening? Can we tell that story? Can we get difficult with it? Can we talk about all those different layers and levels to protest and what they look like? And my colleagues, many of them were brought to tears thinking about these kinds of things. They said, yes, we do work hard to humanize white victims, especially when they die violently. We look through yearbook pictures, we find pets, school play footage, all of that. And so I wrote a piece for The Atlantic that talked about the problem with these police shooting videos, that on the one hand, yes, we need the awareness, but how much is too much? When can we say we've seen enough? We believe that there's a problem. And this is what I challenged our industry to kind of question. And so one of the things that I want to drive home as we begin to open up this Q&A part is that that's where we are now with this Black witnessing, is that we know that we're in this point where sometimes you will still need to see visual proof because Black people's humanity is still not a given. And as ugly as that sounds, it is true to many people. Many people still need a video to be made surely and certainly that they need to get behind a cause. Like, oh, let me see the video first, and then I'll make a determination if I want to support. And Africans and people of African descent know that. And so that's the double-edged sword, is that, yes, I'm going to record this because I want justice, but I know it's going to re-traumatize my own community. It will cause harm to people who already know. But in other instances, it could save our lives. It could get us help. And that's what we saw this past weekend with Africans in Ukraine. And it had me riveted. It was a trending topic on Twitter. And in this brief piece I'll play for you, you'll see some of the themes that became famous in the Black Lives Matter movement replicated here.
Everybody go down. Everybody go down. We are dying of cold. We've been here for 3 days. We died of cold.
So as you can hear the students, they say, we don't have arms. We are students. And they're trying to express their humanity, and they shouldn't have to qualify it with we are students, that we are worthy of being allowed to enter a safe access point. We should be allowed to exit the Ukraine. And at the border, all across the borders, you're seeing videos like this pop up this weekend where young people were held at gunpoint. And in this particular video, you hear them say, everybody go down, everybody take a knee, get out your phones. And this is what Black witnessing is, literally. It is looking from below. They are putting themselves at a lower level physically to say, I'm not a threat, but I am glaring back at you because I want the world to see what is going on, because I know no one will believe me otherwise. It's also relying on that interlocking public sphere we're talking about. So again, these are students who are sending this out because they realize we have no power in this situation. And so you start to see very well-connected Africans participating, saying, who knows whom? We are all in very high positions. How can we get this word out to people who can really make policy changes? And so you again see a group that is relatively marginalized, that is unable to do this work for itself in that moment. And the only thing it can do is pick up that phone and then transmit it to a group within the same ethnic group, but more powerful and able to push it even further. And then the other thing is that it's hacking, again, any technology it needs to. Everyone has a phone, everyone's on Twitter, let's use that. It's not saying, let's go find a guy with a satellite truck and let him know what we think. There's no time for that. And that is the hallmark of Black witnessing that we keep seeing play out across the world at this point. And at many points, you see this very famous message that got almost about 43,000 likes. And it said, "Glad Africans in Ukraine is trending. We can now show solidarity against Putin's aggression while calling out anti-Blackness in Ukraine and Poland." And many other messages went out along this vein that talked about these people also have to deal with COVID. The pandemic is still going on, trying to evacuate a place that is unsafe. And you also have to deal with racism. And so those three layers are what caused Africans in Ukraine to trend. And arguably, this would not have happened without smartphones. The reaction to this was swift. The African Union put out a formal condemnation of this behavior. Embassies in neighboring countries began to mobilize and send buses. And new footage began to spring up of students who had made it across the border and were having these makeshift kind of cots in certain areas in the airport and in bus stations and all these places to try to set up camp. I don't think that that kind of policy change would have been possible that quickly without the smartphone. And then in further service of this hacking technology, you began to see this rise to the top on Sunday evening, Monday morning. There is an Africans in Ukraine group, and it's meeting on Twitter Spaces. So we get to hear the actual voices now of these African students who were stuck. And then we also get to see more footage. And then there's even a link for resources for if you're in this country, this is where you can go to get warm. Because mind you, it's in the teens in the evening and maybe even sub-zero temperatures in some spots. And so Black in Ukraine and Africans in Ukraine becomes a rallying cry to help deal with that other layer of racism. And this is why James Baldwin said, Black people need witnesses in this hostile world. Without those smartphones, arguably, many of those African students may have frozen to death or been killed by the police that they encountered. And so it's important for us always to remember that when we're looking at these pieces of footage, they should be considered precious because someone is putting their body in harm's way to collect it. And that's something we've never been able to see before throughout any of these overlapping eras of domestic terror. During slavery, Black people could not look in real time lest they be punished too. In the lynching photograph I showed you earlier, you didn't see any Black people there. They were likely fleeing town. And in many cases, we have documents that show people would leave 100, 200, 300 people at a time when lynching massacres began. But in this moment with cell phones, Darnella Frazier could do with that cell phone what none of her ancestors could. And she could be there in real time and say with her body and with her phone, I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to stay here with you in these last moments. I'm going to say your name and make sure other people remember your name and try to get justice for you. And it's for that reason that we can't get casual with this footage and that we can't just roll it when we have no other visual on the news. And it's also for this reason that we must develop more robust policies that protect this kind of looking when laws all across the country are popping up to stop it. And so it's in this spirit I want to dedicate this presentation as I close out this part to the littlest witness, to Diana Reynolds, who was in the car when Philando Castile was killed. And as I watched her try to comfort her mom in the back of a squad car as she is handcuffed and say, Mommy, calm down, because I don't want you to get shot too. I watched that piece of footage with my own daughter, who was her same age, and we cried about it. And so I dedicated the book to Diana, who should have been playing with my daughter instead of seeing something like that. And I dedicate this presentation to her and to kids like her who had to grow up seeing their loved ones' last moments played over and over and over again. And I hope for a day that they never have to see any footage like that. And hopefully with the work of you, with the Carr Center, we can get there.
Thank you, Alyssa. This was truly amazing as a tour de force to make us appreciate a lot better how much testimonial injustice throughout history has come from the fact that it's typically the perpetrators, of atrocities, of oppression, who also control the technology of documenting things, whereas the people to whom things are done normally couldn't, right? For that reason, I mean, your examples around the Holocaust and the extermination campaign on the Eastern Front, I think, are incredibly well taken, because we have quite a bunch of photographs from that time, but almost nothing taken by people who were victimized at that moment, because how could they possibly have done it, right? Given the camera standards of the time. So it's basically it's like the lynching photography that was done. It was people who did this as souvenirs, right, to send this home and said, look, this is this great stuff that we did. Yeah, this is, I'm going to start us off with one question now, but also those of you in the audience, please, since we don't have much time left, put your questions in the chat and we will channel them to Alyssa as we see them. I found your brief reference, so many fascinating references in this talk. So one especially intriguing one to Frederick Douglass, right? So Frederick Douglass is said to be the most photographed most photographed person of the 19th century, and he did this very deliberately, right? He wanted to create an image of the humanity of the Black person. He never smiled because he didn't want to feed into this image of the happy slave. Is Frederick Douglass, in a way, is he a predecessor through this use of the photographic technology of the time to the citizen journalism that comes through cell phones these days? Is that a fair history line to draw?
Absolutely. And one of my favorite professors of yours, Sarah Lewis, makes this argument in her Visions and Justice project. And she, as a matter of fact, begins with Frederick Douglass and talks about how he used photography as a key tool to humanize African-American men. So I think that's a perfect parallel. And it is one of the places that I love to start with, because it used that technology, again, hacked it in service of activism.
Mm-hmm.
So I was actually going to start a question with Frederick Douglass, but Matthias beat me to it. So I'll perhaps start with Du Bois then, who in 1900 organized the American Negro exhibit at the Paris Fair, where he brought together this exhibition of hundreds of photographs to depict, a diverse array of African-American images, again, similar to Douglass, sort of countering stereotypes and racist caricatures of the past. So I'm wondering, as you think of the sort of three eras that you outlined and the role of witnessing, can we think of witnessing in the context of joy, emancipation, diversity of human experience, humanity, or does that still feed into this notion that there needs to be a justification for the humanization?
Mm-hmm. I wish there wasn't a need for justifying one's humanity. And I think that's what struck me most about this recent footage at the borders of these Africans who are saying we are students. And it shouldn't matter if they're students or if they're not, if they're just everyday blue collar people just doing what they need to do to survive. It should not matter what one's profession is, but it is almost a survival tactic that many Africans and African Americans learn early on, is to have something that you will be able to say to prove your humanity quite quickly should someone question it. And so I think that this kind of celebration of joy, of Black joy, is a turn that many have tried to embrace after the ghastliness of what we saw with Mr. Floyd. And I think we had so many Black artists and creators say, I'm not going to do any more struggle films. I'm not going to do any more films on slavery. I just want to focus on Black joy for a while. And that is an immediate outgrowth of probably one of the most horrific videos that any of us have had to see. And I think pulling away from that is good in some ways, because it numbs people when they have to continue to see a litany of African Americans dying. And I don't want it to get to a point where we have to see something even worse than Mr. Floyd to get back out into the street in the way that we were in 2020. So both that balance, that celebrating the life and humanity is important, but there's that, realization, that elephant in the room that, people of color still have to prove they're human first before they even make an appeal to human rights.
Let me pass on a question from the audience. Erika Licht is asking, The anecdote you shared about NAACP members reappropriating lynching photographs as a tool for racial justice was powerful. Can you say a bit more about this example or others like it you have found in your research?
Yes, one of the most ghastly photographs I saw, and I purposely didn't show them here because I don't believe we need to show them to talk about it. In doing the research for this book, one of the most ghastly ones was a gentleman in Texas who'd been burned badly and then hanged. And well, he was hanged first, I should say. Let me say the sequence correct. He was hanged first and then burned. And then the caption said, "Look at the barbecue that we had this weekend." And I just couldn't stop looking at it. I just kept thinking, why? Where was the humanity in this moment? Who spoke up? Who participated? Why did people watch this? How did they let it go this far? And then when I read of Ida B. Wells sending allies down to buy specifically that postcard and get it out of circulation, I wondered how afraid they must have been going into this space, that they'd be found out that they were not allies of this movement, but they were actually allies of Black folks up north. And I thought the fear that must have surrounded them to even go into that space voluntarily and buy them all up, the pretense that they had to probably engage in, like, oh yeah, I want to buy a ton of these for my grandma and grandpa and Christmas presents and things like that. Just all of that intrigued me so much. And I think that the fact that NAACP was able to do this with their membership fees was intriguing to me, because in the early 1900s, in fact, the only reason they were gathering that much money for their membership dues is because they wanted to create a successful lobby against lynching. And they were trying to push for an anti-lynching law to pass, which never did pass. And so they took out a full-page ad in the New York Times with money from that magazine, that issue of the Crisis that featured that postcard. And those were really high selling magazines for them, because when African Americans purchased that Crisis and saw that, memberships would skyrocket, and it would enable them to engage in that lobbying that they needed to. So again, that shadow archive served a key purpose. And I argue now that these videos serve the same purpose, and that they should be reserved for families who need closure and juries who need to make tough decisions about what should happen to someone. The public, I think we've seen enough, and I think it's very difficult for us to keep looking at these without getting numb or re-traumatized.
So a colleague of ours at the Carr Center, who you might know, Dr. Megan Ming Francis, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post 2 years ago. The white press has a history of endangering Black lives going back a century. And she captures examples of national press spreading false stories or covering up massacres and racial violence. And I'm wondering, what is the role of citizen journalists and community activists in holding mainstream media accountable? And it's not just the role of the person on the street to do this kind of capture, and and also the ethical ways in which images are used and reused.
One of my favorite scholars, Danielle Kilgo, wrote a wonderful piece a few months ago that basically said, we as a journalism industry have to get away from the police said narrative. And she very brilliantly pulls out, police said that George Floyd died in the back of a medical van as a result of a medical incident. And that's true factually, but unless you saw that video, you maybe want to dismiss that. You may just say, okay, well, he died in the back of a van after a medical incident involving police. But after seeing Darnella Fraser's video, there is no refuting that that is not entirely what has happened, and that his civil rights were stripped from him. And so that police said narrative is what has been challenged most often. And in fact, that police said narrative was parroted in the early editions of the New York Times that did report it just that way. And initially were embarrassed by that and had to go back and re-report. We've also seen that in the case of Walter Scott, where initially police said that he went for the officer's taser, and so he had to be shot. But then here comes a citizen journalist who is recording from the bushes and shows Walter Scott being shot in the back. And so now that officer is now in prison for lying, and it's embarrassing to the news organizations that pick that up. So I think the biggest thing that citizen journalists have been able to push is that there is an alternative narrative that's going on. And a lot of times you wouldn't know what that alternative was had someone not had their cell phone. And that's why Darnella Frazier earned that special citation by the Pulitzer Prize Committee this last year, because it's not something that just anyone gets. And it's the first time a citizen journalist did get it.
And even that was controversial, right?
Yes, it was very controversial.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Richardson, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you for having me.